Mira had exactly one thought as she sprinted through the dark tree line, branches tearing at her sleeves, lungs burning. Don't look back. Looking back meant seeing how close he was. Looking back meant seeing his face, twisted with the kind of rage that used to come out only when nobody else was watching, and lately came out whenever he wanted it to. She'd stopped being afraid of Dorian slowly, in pieces, the way you stop noticing a smell you've lived with too long. And then, 3 nights ago, she'd woken up with a bruise on her wrist shaped exactly like his hand, and the fear had come back all at once, sharp and clarifying. She ran. The forest between the Ashwood Pack lands and whatever lay beyond them wasn't supposed to be crossed by unmated Omegas alone. Not at night. Not ever, really. Mira didn't care. She'd rather take her chances with wolves that didn't know her name than spend one more week promised to a man who'd started treating promised like it meant owned. Her wolf, small and skittish by nature, pushed her legs faster than she thought her body could manage. Somewhere behind her, she heard shouting Dorian's voice, and beneath it, the low, furious growl of a wolf losing patience with a woman who wouldn't stay where she was put. She didn't stop when the trees thinned, didn't stop when the ground turned to open field. She only stopped when she collided, hard, with something that did not move. What in the impact knocked the breath clean out of her? Mira staggered back, and a hand shot out to catch her elbow before she hit the ground, steadying her with a grip that was firm without being crushing. She looked up. And up. The man in front of her was enormous, not just tall, but built like something meant to withstand impact, shoulders that blocked out most of the moonlight behind him, dark hair a little too long, falling loose around a face that would have been beautiful if it weren't currently arranged into an expression of complete bewilderment. "Are you hurt?" he asked, voice low, rough at the edges like he wasn't used to speaking gently and was doing it deliberately anyway. Mira couldn't answer right away. Her chest was heaving, her legs shaking, and somewhere behind her the shouting had gotten closer. "There's someone chasing me," she managed finally, the words coming out in a rush. "Please, I need..." She didn't get to finish. Dorian burst through the tree line behind her, breathing hard, eyes gone gold with the particular fury of an alpha who'd been made to run after something he considered already his. "Mira," her name came out of him like a threat. "You don't get to run from me." The stranger's grip on her arm tightened, not painfully, but enough that Mira understood, with sudden and total clarity, that he had placed himself very deliberately between her and Dorian. "I don't know who you are," the stranger said, voice gone flat and dangerous in a way that made even Dorian hesitate mid-stride, "but you're going to want to think very carefully about your next sentence." "She's my mate," Dorian snarled. "Promise to me. This isn't your business." Something shifted in the stranger's posture, subtle, but Mira felt it even standing beside him, a kind of stillness that felt more threatening than any amount of shouting could have. "She ran from you," he said, "through my territory, screaming for help, from what I heard." A pause, cold and deliberate. "That makes it very much my business." Dorian's eyes narrowed, calculating, and Mira watched something like recognition cross his face, recognition, and beneath it, the first flicker of actual fear. "Your Dorian started, King Ashgrave," the stranger said, and Mira felt her own breath catch, because she'd heard that name before, whispered in Ashwood Pack meetings with a mixture of respect and wariness reserved for the most powerful alpha in the territory. "And you've just chased a terrified woman onto my land, which means whatever claim you think you have just became significantly more complicated." Dorian's jaw worked, fury and calculation warring across his face. "This isn't over," he said, though the words came out with considerably less confidence than before. "It is tonight," King Ashgrave said. "Leave my territory." Now, for a moment, Mira thought Dorian might actually challenge him, the old familiar tension in his shoulders that always preceded violence rising visibly. But whatever he saw in the king's stillness made him think better of it. He turned, spat something under his breath she didn't catch, and disappeared back into the tree line. Mira's legs finally gave out. She would have hit the ground if the king hadn't caught her, one arm sliding around her waist with a gentleness that felt entirely at odds with the terrifying stillness he'd shown Dorian moments earlier. "You're safe," he said, quieter now. "He's gone." "For now," Mira whispered, still shaking. "For now," he agreed. He didn't let go of her right away, and Mira found she didn't want him to. "Can you tell me your name?" "Mira," she said. "Mira Vance, from Ashwood Pack." "I'm Kale," he said, and something about the way he offered his given name rather than his title made her chest loosen slightly for the first time since she'd started running. "Come inside. You're freezing, and I suspect you have a great deal to tell me." The king's home was nothing like Mira had expected from a man whose reputation preceded him through 3 Pack territories, not Coldstone and intimidating grandeur, but something warmer, lived in, a fire already crackling in a hearth that made the entire main room glow gold. "Sit," Kale said, gesturing to a chair near the fire, then seemed to catch himself, softening the command into something closer to a request. "Please, you look like you're about to fall over." Mira sat, mostly because her legs had stopped fully cooperating several minutes ago. A woman appeared from somewhere deeper in the house, older, kind-faced, immediately understanding the situation without needing it explained. "I'll bring tea," she said, and disappeared before Mira could thank her. "You don't have to explain anything tonight," Kyle said, settling into the chair across from her, close enough to be present but far enough to give her space. "But if you want to, I'm listening." Mira looked at her hands, at the fading bruise on her wrist she hadn't quite managed to hide, and found the words coming out slower than she expected, but coming out nonetheless. "Dorian and I were promised when I was 15, she said. "Pack alliance. Our fathers arranged it before either of us had any say. For years it was just an arrangement. Distant. He barely spoke to me except at formal gatherings. And then his father died 2 years ago, and he became Alpha, and something changed." Her voice went quieter. "He started expecting things. Control, mostly, where I went, who I spoke to, how I dressed. And when I didn't comply exactly the way he wanted, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to." Kale's jaw tightened, something dark passing behind his eyes before he visibly reined it back in. "How long has this been happening?" he asked, voice carefully controlled. "Months," Mira admitted. "I kept telling myself it would get better, that he was under pressure, adjusting to leadership, that it wasn't really." She stopped again. "It doesn't matter what I told myself. 3 nights ago he grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise because I spoke to another pack member without his permission first. I realized I was done making excuses for him. So you ran." "I didn't have a plan," Mira said, almost laughing at how absurd it sounded now, in the warmth of his home, with tea arriving in a chipped ceramic cup that felt more welcoming than anything she'd owned in years. "I just ran. I didn't even know whose territory I was crossing into." "Lucky then," Kale said, "that you ran into mine. Are you always this calm when strange women crash into you in the dark?" Something almost like a smile crossed his face. "Never happened before. I'm making this up as I go." Mira found herself smiling too, despite everything, despite the exhaustion and fear still sitting heavy in her chest. "You're doing well, for someone improvising." High praise from someone I nearly knocked flat on her back. The housekeeper returned with blankets, fussing over Mira with a maternal efficiency that made something in her chest ache. She hadn't been fussed over like that in years, not since her own mother had died when she was 12, leaving her to grow up in a household run by a father more interested in political alliances than in whether his daughter felt safe. "You should sleep," Kyle said eventually, once the tea was finished and Mira's shaking had settled into something closer to exhausted stillness. "There's a guest room made up. Nobody will bother you here tonight. And tomorrow? Tomorrow we figure out what happens next, he said. Tonight, you rest. Mira followed the housekeeper up a narrow staircase to a room that smelled like lavender and clean linen, and sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed for a long moment before finally allowing herself to lie down, exhaustion pulling her under faster than she expected. She dreamed, briefly, of Dorian's face twisted with fury. But underneath that dream, quieter, was another one, a man with dark hair and careful eyes, standing between her and everything that had ever frightened her. Saying you're safe like it was simply a fact rather than a promise that could break. She woke to sunlight and the smell of something cooking downstairs, and for the first time in months, didn't immediately feel her stomach drop with dread at the thought of the day ahead. Mira came downstairs the next morning to find Kyle already awake, seated at a long wooden table with papers spread in front of him, a cup of something steaming beside his elbow, dark hair pulled back from his face in a way that made him look younger somehow, less like the terrifying king she'd heard whispered about, and more like an ordinary man doing ordinary work. You slept, he said, looking up, something like relief crossing his features. Good, I wasn't sure you would. I didn't think I would either, Mira admitted, sliding into the seat across from him after a moment's hesitation. This is the first full night's sleep I've had in weeks. Something flickered across his face at that admission, anger, quickly suppressed, replaced by something gentler. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, he said. For safety and for rest. I can't impose on you indefinitely, Mira said, though the words felt hollow even as she said them, because the alternative was returning to Ashwood Pack and Dorian's hand around her wrist. You're not imposing, Kale said. And Dorian isn't foolish enough to attempt anything within my territory. You're safe here, for as long as you need to be. Why? Mira asked, the question slipping out before she'd fully decided to voice it. You don't know me. I ran into your land in the middle of the night, and you've fed me, housed me, defended me against another alpha's claim. Why would you do all that for a stranger? Kale was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything. Because I know what it looks like when someone's been made to feel small, he said finally. And I don't have much patience for men who do that to people weaker than themselves. You don't know I'm weaker than him. Something that might have been approval crossed his face. No, he agreed. I don't. That's a fair correction. Over the following days, Mira found herself settling into a rhythm she hadn't experienced in years, mornings spent helping in the kitchen, despite the housekeeper's protests that guests shouldn't work. Afternoons spent in quiet conversation with Kyle as he worked through pack business. Evenings by the fire that had become, somehow, the most comfortable part of her day. You don't act like the stories about you, she told him one evening, several days into her stay, watching him frown over a stack of correspondence. What stories? That you're ruthless, terrifying, that you once had a man exiled for insulting your judgment during a border dispute. That last one is true, Kale admitted, without shame. He was inciting violence against a neighboring pack over a resource dispute that could have been solved diplomatically. Exile was more merciful than the alternative he was proposing. And the terrifying part? Also occasionally true, he said. But not with everyone, not with people who haven't given me reason to be. And what would give you reason? His eyes met hers, something steady and unshakable in them. Cruelty, he said, especially toward people who can't easily defend themselves. Mira thought about Dorian's hand around her wrist and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly how much danger her former fiancé would be in if Kyle ever learned the full extent of what had happened before she ran. Ashwood Pack will demand my return eventually, she said instead, changing the subject before it could go somewhere neither of them was ready for yet. Dorian won't let this go quietly. There's a treaty between our packs. Alliances that depend on the marriage. Let them demand. Kyle said. You're a grown woman, Mira. Not property to be returned like a borrowed tool. Pack law doesn't always see it that way. Pack law, Kale said, answers to me in this territory. And I have no intention of handing you back to a man who leaves bruises shaped like his hand on someone he claims to want to marry. Something in Mira's chest loosened at the fierce certainty in his voice, not just protection offered out of obligation, but something that felt, increasingly, like it came from somewhere more personal. You barely know me, she said again, quieter this time. I know enough, Kyle said, and I intend to know more, if you'll let me. The letter from Ashwood Pack arrived exactly 8 days after Mira's arrival, carried by a rider who looked distinctly uncomfortable delivering it, sealed with the Pack's official crest and Dorian's own signature beneath a formal demand for her immediate return. Kyle read it in the main hall, expression unreadable, while Mira watched from across the room, her stomach twisting with a dread she'd hoped had started to fade. He's framing it as a treaty violation, Kyle said finally, setting the letter down with deliberate calm, claiming you were promised, and that harboring you constitutes an act of aggression against Ashwood Pack. What happens now? Now I respond, Kyle said, explaining that I have no intention of returning an adult woman to a man who assaults her, and that if Ashwood Pack wishes to pursue this as a treaty matter, I'm entirely prepared to have that conversation in front of the full Territorial Council, including whatever evidence exists of Dorian's conduct. There isn't much evidence, Mira admitted. Bruises fade. Nobody in Ashwood witnessed it directly, and even if they had, most wouldn't speak against their own alpha. Then we'll find another way, Kale said, though something in his jaw had tightened at her words. I won't send you back regardless of what evidence exists or doesn't. That's not a negotiable point. You're risking a treaty conflict over someone you've known for 8 days. I'm risking a treaty conflict over someone who deserves better than what she was given, Kyle corrected. Those aren't the same calculation. The response letter was sent within the hour, and the following days brought attention Mira hadn't anticipated, not fear exactly, not with Kyle's steady presence beside her, but a persistent awareness that this conflict was far from resolved. That Dorian wasn't the kind of man who simply accepted losing. That awareness proved correct 4 days later, when Dorian himself arrived at the territorial border, flanked by a small contingent of Ashwood Pack members demanding a formal audience. I'll meet with him, Kale said, when the news reached him. You don't have to be present. I want to be, Mira said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I'm tired of being discussed like I'm not in the room. Kyle studied her for a long moment, then nodded, something like respect in his expression. Then you'll be present. And you'll speak, if you choose to. Nobody will silence you in my hall. The meeting took place in the same main room where Mira had first been given tea and blankets, though the atmosphere now carried none of that earlier warmth. Dorian stood stiffly near the entrance, flanked by 2 pack members who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the entire situation, his eyes finding Mira immediately with an expression that made her skin crawl despite the distance between them. Mira, he said, voice carefully controlled, performing reasonableness for an audience that wasn't fooled. You've caused quite a stir. It's time to come home. This isn't my home, Mira said, surprised by how steady her own voice came out. It hasn't felt like home in a very long time. We're promised to each other, Dorian said. This entire situation is beneath both of us. You grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a bruise because I spoke to someone without your permission, Mira said, watching his expression flicker with something like alarm at the words being spoken openly, in front of witnesses. That's not a promise I intend to honor. That's not Dorian started, then seemed to recalculate his approach entirely, turning toward Kyle instead. Your Majesty, whatever she's told you, This is a domestic matter between promised mates. Surely you understand the complexity of pack politics well enough not to interfere in I understand assault when it's described to me plainly, Kyle said, voice flat and dangerous in a way that made even Dorian's pack members shift uncomfortably. And I understand that a treaty built on forcing a woman back into a household where she isn't safe is not a treaty worth honoring. You have no authority over Ashwood pack matters. I have complete authority over what happens on my own land, Kale said, and Mira Vance chose to seek refuge here. She remains here by her own choice, not by any claim you believe you hold over her. Dorian's composure cracked slightly, fury flashing behind carefully controlled features. This isn't over, he said, echoing the same words he'd used the night Mira first ran. It is, Kyle said. Unless you'd like to test exactly how far my patience extends. Dorian left the meeting with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with, though the tension of his visit lingered in the household for days afterward, a low hum of unresolved threat that made Mira's sleep restless despite Kael's assurances of safety. He won't simply accept this, she told Kael one evening, several days after the confrontation, watching firelight flicker across his face as he worked through correspondence related to the ongoing treaty dispute. You don't know him the way I do. He doesn't lose gracefully. I don't need him to lose gracefully, Kyle said. I need him to lose, period. Grace is optional. He'll find another approach. Something quieter than a direct confrontation. Then we'll be prepared for it, Kyle said, setting down his papers, giving her his full attention in a way that still surprised her, even weeks into her stay, how completely he seemed to listen when she spoke. What are you afraid he'll try? Mira considered the question seriously. Political pressure, probably. He'll appeal to the broader territorial council, argue that harboring me sets a dangerous precedent for pack alliances generally. Convince other alphas that today it's me, tomorrow it could be any promised mate deciding they'd rather not honor an arrangement. That's a reasonable concern for other alphas to have, Kyle acknowledged. Which means we need evidence beyond your testimony alone, something that makes this specifically about Dorian's conduct rather than a general precedent about broken arrangements. There isn't much evidence, Mira said again, the same worry she'd voiced before. Bruises fade. Nobody witnessed anything directly. What about before the bruises? Kyle asked. Did anyone in Ashwood witness a pattern of behavior, even if they wouldn't call it violence outright? Controlling behavior? Isolating you from others? Anything documented or witnessed? Mira thought carefully, memory sifting through months of small, accumulating wrongs she'd spent so long minimizing to herself that articulating them now felt strange. His sister, she said slowly. Ren, she's tried to talk to him about how he treats me, more than once. She might be willing to speak, if approached carefully. Would she risk her own position within the pack by doing so? Probably, Mira admitted. But she's tried before, privately. I think part of her has been waiting for someone else to finally make it impossible to ignore. A message was sent quietly, through channels careful enough not to alert Dorian directly, and 3 days later, Ren herself arrived at Kyle's territory, travel-worn but resolute, carrying with her not just her own testimony, but written accounts from 2 other pack members who'd witnessed enough of Dorian's controlling behavior over the years to feel compelled. Finally, to speak plainly about it. I should have said something sooner, Ren told Mira, guilt evident in every line of her posture. I watched him become someone I didn't recognize after our father died, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in his relationship. I was wrong. You're here now, Mira said, surprised by how much relief flooded through her at finally having someone from her old life confirm what she'd spent so long doubting about her own perception. That matters more than the delay. The territorial council meeting, when it finally convened 2 weeks later, proved far less contentious than Mira had feared. The combined weight of Wren's testimony and the written accounts from other pack members shifting the conversation entirely away from abstract concerns about precedent and firmly toward the specific, undeniable pattern of Dorian's behavior. The council finds, the presiding elder announced finally, after hours of testimony and deliberation, that the arrangement between Mira Vance and Dorian Ashwood is dissolved, effective immediately, due to documented pattern of controlling and abusive conduct on the part of Alpha Dorian Ashwood. Dorian's face, across the room, went white with fury and humiliation in equal measure, though the presence of the full territorial council prevented any outburst. His composure held together by nothing more than the awareness of witnesses. "This isn't justice," he said, low and furious. "This is a king using his influence to steal nothing." Kyle interrupted, voice carrying easily across the hall. "Mira Vance was never property to be stolen. She's a person who chose safety over a promise built on cruelty. The council's decision reflects that, not my influence." The meeting concluded with Dorian's formal removal from any claim over Mira, the treaty between their packs renegotiated to remove the marriage clause entirely, replaced instead with standard trade and border agreements that required nothing of Mira personally. She felt the weight lift from her shoulders the moment the council's decision was formalized, a freedom so complete it left her slightly dizzy, as though she'd been carrying an invisible burden for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. The weeks following the council's decision brought a kind of peace Mira hadn't experienced since childhood, before her father's political ambitions had reshaped her entire future around an arrangement she'd never chosen. She stayed on at Kyle's territory, initially telling herself it was simply practical. She had nowhere else established to go, no immediate resources to rebuild an independent life elsewhere. But as weeks turned into a month, then, too, she found herself acknowledging a quieter truth beneath the practical justifications. She didn't want to leave. "You've been staring at that same page for 20 minutes, KL observed one afternoon, finding her in the study with a book open in front of her that she clearly wasn't reading. "I've been thinking," Mira admitted, closing the book with a soft laugh at being caught, "about what happens next. I can't stay here indefinitely without some kind of plan. Why not?" The simple question caught her off guard. "Because eventually, people will talk. A woman staying indefinitely in the king's household, no formal position, no clear reason for remaining. Let them talk," Kale said, echoing words he'd said to her weeks earlier about Dorian's demands. Though the context now felt entirely different. "Unless the reason you're worried about staying is that you don't want to." Mira looked up at him, something in his tone making her chest tighten with an awareness she'd been carefully avoiding for weeks. "That's not what I'm worried about." "Then what are you worried about?" She hesitated, weighing honesty against the safer comfort of vague deflection. "I'm worried about wanting to stay for reasons that have nothing to do with practical safety anymore," she admitted finally, "and not knowing if that want is reciprocated, or if I'm simply confusing gratitude with something else." Something shifted in Kyle's expression surprise, quickly replaced by a careful, deliberate warmth that made her breath catch. "It's not gratitude," he said, "at least, not on my end." "How do you know?" "Because I've spent the last 2 months finding excuses to be in whatever room you're in," he said, the admission coming out with a bluntness that suggested he'd been holding it back deliberately, waiting for the right moment. "Because I think about you constantly, in ways that have nothing to do with your safety and everything to do with wanting you here, specifically, permanently, if you'll have that." Mira's heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "You've never said anything. I didn't want to press you into something before you were ready," Kyle said. "You'd just escaped an arrangement built on control. The last thing I wanted was to become another man deciding what you should want, before you'd had space to figure that out for yourself." "That's remarkably considerate for a man with your reputation," Mira said, though her voice had gone soft. something warm unfurling in her chest at the careful patience he'd apparently been exercising for weeks, without her fully realizing it. "I've had considerable motivation to be considerate," Kale said. "You matter to me. I wasn't going to risk that by rushing something you weren't ready for." "And now?" "Now I'm asking," he said, closing the distance between them with careful, deliberate steps, not as an alpha claiming a mate, not as a king making a political decision, just as Kyle, asking if you'd consider staying because you want to, not because circumstances left you with nowhere else to go. Mira reached up, without fully deciding to, and touched his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath her fingers, an intimacy she hadn't allowed herself to consider until this exact moment. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else. Because somewhere in the last 2 months, this became the place I actually want to be." The kiss that followed was slow, careful, neither of them rushing toward something that had been building patiently for weeks, Kyle's hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the barely restrained intensity she could feel beneath his careful control. Mira sinking into it with a certainty she hadn't expected to feel this fully, this quickly, after everything. "I should have done that weeks ago," Kyle murmured, when they finally broke apart. "I would have accepted weeks ago," Mira said, laughing softly, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Good to know for future reference," he said, and pulled her close again. The relationship that followed developed with none of the frantic urgency Mira had expected romance to require, instead settling into something steady and unhurried, built on the foundation of trust they'd already established during those first anxious weeks of her arrival. Kyle courted her properly, in ways that surprised her constantly small gestures rather than grand ones, remembering details she'd mentioned only once in passing, adjusting his schedule to accommodate quiet evenings she hadn't asked for but appreciated more than she knew how to express. "You don't have to keep doing things like this," she told him one evening, discovering he'd arranged for her favorite tea to be stocked specifically because she'd mentioned enjoying it during a conversation weeks earlier. "I want to," he said, exactly as he'd said about her safety, about her staying, about every other consideration he'd extended since the night she'd crashed into him in the dark. "You spent years with someone who made you feel like your preferences were an inconvenience. I'd like to spend considerably longer proving the opposite." Wren, who'd remained at Kyle's territory in the aftermath of the council's decision rather than returning immediately to an Ashwood pack still reeling from Dorian's public humiliation, became a close friend during this period, offering Mira a connection to her old life that felt safe rather than threatening. "He's different with you than the stories suggested," Wren observed once, watching Kyle across the room in quiet conversation with a visiting dignitary. "The terrifying king everyone whispers about." "He's terrifying when the situation calls for it," Mira said. "Gentle when it doesn't. I've come to appreciate that he understands the difference." "Dorian never understood any difference," Wren said, quieter now. "Everything was control, all the time, regardless of what the situation actually required." "I know," Mira said, reaching for her friend's hand. "I'm sorry you had to watch that happen to your brother, and to me for so long before anyone finally addressed it properly." "I'm sorry it took me so long to speak up," Wren said. "You deserved better. Sooner, Ashwood Pack, in the months following the council's decision, underwent its own quiet transformation. Dorian's authority weakened significantly by the public nature of his exposure, eventually stepping down in favor of a cousin whose temperament proved considerably more suited to leadership than possession. Wren herself took on an advisory role within the new leadership structure, her sharp judgment and first-hand understanding of what had gone wrong under her brother's rule proving valuable in preventing similar patterns from taking root again. Mira's own relationship with Kyle deepened steadily through the following months, each week revealing new layers of a man whose public reputation had never captured the full complexity of who he actually was, fierce in defense of people he cared about. patient in ways that surprised even his own advisors, capable of a tenderness that felt entirely at odds with the terrifying stories that preceded him through every territory he ruled. "I used to think love was something arranged," Mira told him one evening, months into their relationship, watching sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose outside the window of what had become, gradually, unmistakably, her home. Something negotiated between families, with feelings entirely optional. "And now I understand it's supposed to feel like this," she said. "Chosen, wanted, specifically, for exactly who I am rather than what I represent politically." "You are wanted," Kyle said, pulling her close. "Specifically, entirely, for exactly who you are." The proposal, when it came, surprised her with its simplicity. No grand ceremony, no elaborate performance. Just Kyle kneeling in the same garden where they'd shared countless quiet evenings over the preceding months, asking her plainly if she'd choose to stay with him permanently, as his wife rather than simply his guest, his equal rather than his subject. "Yes," Mira said, before he'd even finished the full question, laughing at her own eagerness. "Yes, absolutely. Completely, yes." Their wedding took place in early autumn, small and intimate by royal standards, held in the same garden where Kyle had proposed, surrounded by falling leaves in shades of amber and gold that matched, almost too perfectly, the warm lighting of the late afternoon sun. Wren stood among the witnesses, along with the housekeeper who'd first offered Mira tea and blankets on that terrifying first night, and a handful of pack members from Kyle's territory who'd come to know Mira over the preceding months as someone who belonged there, rather than a temporary refugee awaiting some eventual departure. "You look happy," Wren whispered, adjusting the simple, elegant gown Mira had chosen over anything more elaborate, understanding without needing it explained why Mira had wanted something unpretentious for this particular day, given everything the alternative Dorian's arranged marriage had represented. "I am happy," Mira said, meaning it completely, more than I ever expected to be. Honestly, the ceremony itself was brief, neither of them wanting elaborate ritual over simple, direct vows spoken plainly to each other rather than performed for an audience. Kyle's voice, when he spoke his vows, carried none of the careful control she'd grown accustomed to in political settings, instead rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I promise to choose you every day," he said, "not because circumstances require it, but because I want to. I promise to listen when you speak, to value your judgment as equal to my own, and to never make you feel small in service of my own comfort." Mira felt tears threaten as she spoke her own vows in response, promising the same in return, promising partnership rather than obedience. Honesty rather than performance, a marriage built on choice rather than obligation. The following year brought its own gentle rhythm of adjustment, Mira gradually taking on responsibilities within Kyle's territory that suited her own particular strengths, mediating disputes between pack members with a patience and empathy that came naturally from her own experience of feeling unheard, while Kyle continued managing the broader political complexities that came with ruling territory as significant as his. "You're good at this," Kyle observed once, watching her navigate a particularly delicate dispute between two families with a fairness that left both sides feeling genuinely heard rather than simply overruled. "Better than most advisors I've worked with. I spent years learning to read people carefully," Mira said, understanding what they actually needed versus what they said they wanted. "Dorian taught me that skill, inadvertently, by making it necessary for survival. I'm sorry you had to learn it that way." "I'm not," Mira said, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "It's part of what makes me useful now. I wouldn't undo the lesson, even knowing the cost of learning it." Their first child, a daughter they named Wren in honor of the sister-in-law turned friend who'd risked everything to speak truth against her own brother, arrived nearly 2 years after the wedding, small and fierce from her very first cry, inheriting her mother's stubborn determination alongside her father's careful, protective intensity. She's going to be difficult, Kyle observed, watching their daughter refuse to settle despite every soothing technique the midwife suggested. Good, Mira said, echoing sentiments that had become something of a private joke between them over the preceding 2 years. This world needs more women who refuse to accept being told what to do. Ashwood Pack, in the years that followed, settled into a stability it hadn't known during Dorian's leadership, his cousin proving a capable and fair alpha whose approach to governance bore little resemblance to the controlling patterns that had defined his predecessor's rule. Dorian himself faded gradually from relevance, stripped of his authority and increasingly isolated as former allies distanced themselves from association with someone whose conduct had been so publicly and thoroughly discredited. Mira heard occasional news of him through Wren's continued correspondence reports of a man growing bitter in isolation, unable to fully accept the loss of status and control that had once defined his entire sense of self. She felt, when she heard these updates, less satisfaction than she might have expected, and more a kind of distant relief that his diminishment no longer had any bearing on her own life or safety. "Do you ever think about him?" Wren asked once, during one of her regular visits to Kale's territory, watching Mira's daughter toddle unsteadily across the garden with the same wildflowers Kale had originally shown her years earlier. "Rarely," Mira admitted. "And when I do, it feels like remembering someone else's life. A version of myself I don't fully recognize anymore, who tolerated things I'd never accept now." "You've changed a great deal," Wren said, not unkindly. "I've become who I was always supposed to be," Mira corrected gently, "before circumstances convinced me otherwise for far too long." The garden itself had grown considerably over the years, expanded gradually to include a small orchard KL had planted specifically for their daughter, and later their son, born 3 years after his sister. Quieter in temperament, but sharing the same fierce loyalty that seemed to run through both sides of their family regardless of individual disposition. "Tell me the story again," young Wren demanded one evening, curled against her mother's side while KL worked through correspondence nearby, half listening with the particular attention parents develop for stories they've heard requested many times before. "Which story?" Mira asked, though she already knew. "The one where you ran into Papa in the dark forest." Mira smiled, settling into the familiar rhythm of a story she'd told countless times, each telling slightly different depending on her daughter's mood, though the core of it remained constant, a frightened woman running from a cruel arrangement, colliding unexpectedly with a stranger who chose, immediately and without hesitation, to protect rather than exploit her vulnerability. "I was running from someone very unkind," Mira began, "through a forest I didn't know, in the middle of the night, more frightened than I'd ever been in my entire life. And then, you ran into Papa," young Wren supplied eagerly, having memorized this part through repetition. "I ran directly into Papa," Mira confirmed, so hard I nearly knocked myself flat on the ground. And instead of being angry about a stranger crashing into him in the dark, he asked if I was hurt. "Because he's kind," young Wren said, with the absolute certainty children bring to statements about their parents. "Because he's kind," Mira agreed, glancing across the room at Kyle, who'd stopped pretending not to listen entirely, watching them both with an expression of quiet, contented warmth that still, after all these years, made her chest tighten with gratitude for the particular twist of fate that had sent her running through his territory that terrifying, transformative night. "And you lived happily ever after," young Wren concluded, the ending she always insisted upon regardless of how much detail preceded it. "We're still working on that part," Kale said, finally joining the conversation, crossing the room to settle beside them both. "Happily ever after takes ongoing effort, little one, but we're doing quite well with it so far. Years passed with the particular gentleness of a life built on genuine partnership rather than obligation, and Mira found herself, increasingly, unable to fully recall the specific texture of the fear that had once defined so much of her existence under Dorian's arrangement. Her daughter, Wren, grew into a young woman with a sharp mind for diplomacy, spending increasing time shadowing her father's political work with an interest that surprised nobody who'd watched her grow up, mediating minor disputes between palace staff with the same patient fairness her mother had always demonstrated. "She's going to run this territory better than either of us someday," Kyle observed once, watching their daughter navigate a genuinely complex trade negotiation between two visiting pack representatives with a composure well beyond her years. "She's inherited the best parts of both of us," Mira said, watching with quiet pride. "Your strategic patience, my ability to read what people actually need versus what they claim to want." Their son, quieter and more introspective than his sister, developed instead a fascination with the territory's history, spending hours in the palace archives reading through records of previous rulers, occasionally emerging with questions that made even experienced advisors pause to consider answers more carefully than they'd expected to need. "Why did the old pact system exist?" he asked once, having stumbled across records of an ancient agreement similar in nature to the one that had originally bound Mira to Dorian, though from an entirely different territory's history, if everyone eventually recognized how unfair it was. "Because systems built on convenience rarely get questioned until someone brave enough insists on questioning them," Kyle told him, exchanging a glance with Mira that carried the weight of their own shared history. "Your mother taught me that lesson, among others." Ashwood Pack's continued stability under new leadership eventually led to a formal renewal of alliance between the two territories, no longer built on arranged marriage or forced obligation, but on genuine mutual benefit and respect, a treaty negotiation that Mira herself participated in directly, her unique understanding of both territories proving invaluable in crafting an agreement that served both populations fairly. "It's strange," she told Kyle one evening, years after that first terrified night running through his territory, "how completely different my life became from what I expected back when I was 15 and first promised to Dorian." "Better or worse strange?" "Better," she said, without hesitation. "Immeasurably, completely better. I used to think my life was already determined, my choices limited to enduring an arrangement I hadn't chosen. I never imagined running away could lead somewhere this good." "You didn't run toward something good specifically," Kyle reminded her gently. "You ran away from something terrible and happened to collide with something better entirely by chance." "Does the chance matter, in the end?" Mira asked. "Or only where it eventually led?" Kyle considered the question seriously, watching their children through the window, their daughter deep in conversation with a visiting diplomat, their son absorbed in a book far too advanced for his age. The garden around them full of the same wildflowers that had first drawn Mira's attention on quieter evenings years earlier, back when this life still felt uncertain and new rather than fully, comfortably established. "I think both matter," he said finally. "The chance that brought you here, and everything we chose to build afterward, deliberately, together, rather than leaving it to circumstance alone." Mira leaned into him, watching the same sunset that had painted their wedding day years earlier, feeling the particular contentment of a life built exactly as it should have been from the very beginning, not through arrangement or obligation, but through the accumulated weight of genuine choice, repeated daily, deliberately, by two people who'd found each other through chance and chosen, every day since, to stay. The territorial council meetings that had once filled Mira with dread during those early, uncertain months following her arrival had gradually transformed over the years into something she approached with genuine confidence. Her voice carrying weight among advisors who'd initially been skeptical of a woman with no formal political training, suddenly participating in significant governance decisions. "You've earned their respect through demonstrated judgment," Kyle told her once, after a particularly contentious meeting where her insight had ultimately swayed the council toward a more equitable resolution regarding resource distribution between smaller pack territories. "Not through my position alone. It took time," Mira acknowledged. "The early meetings, Some of them looked at me like I was simply your wife, offering opinions out of politeness rather than actual expertise. And now? Now most of them ask my opinion before offering their own, she said, smiling slightly at how far she'd come from that terrified, uncertain woman who'd first collided with Kale in the dark, unable to imagine any future beyond simple survival, let alone genuine influence over territorial governance. Wren, now well into her 20s, had taken on increasing responsibility within the palace's diplomatic functions, her sharp instincts for negotiation making her an invaluable asset during increasingly complex treaty discussions with territories beyond their immediate borders. "I've been offered a formal advisory position," she told her parents one evening, evident nervousness beneath her usual composure. "Permanent, not just shadowing yours anymore. My own role, my own authority." "You've earned it," Kale said, pride evident in his voice. "More than earned it. Honestly, I want to accept," Wren said, "but I wanted to ask you both first. Make sure it's not overstepping. Given everything, you're not overstepping anything," Mira interrupted gently. "You've spent years demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment this territory needs in its next generation of leadership. Accept it, with our complete support." The formal ceremony marking Wren's new position took place the following month, small but significant, marking a transition that felt, to Mira, like tangible proof of everything they'd built over the preceding decade, not just a marriage, not just a family, but a genuine legacy of governance built on fairness and mutual respect rather than the controlling arrangements that had once nearly defined her entire existence. Dorian, she learned around this same time, had died quietly the previous winter, isolated and largely forgotten by a pack that had moved considerably beyond the patterns he'd once enforced, his death marked by little more than a brief, formal acknowledgement rather than any genuine mourning. "Do you feel anything, hearing that?" Kale asked carefully, watching her process the news with an expression he couldn't quite read. Mira considered the question honestly, searching for some deeper emotional response and finding, mostly, a kind of quiet closure rather than grief or satisfaction. "Mostly I feel like it's finally, completely over," she said. "A chapter closed rather than something still requiring attention or fear." "Good," Kyle said simply, pulling her close. "You deserve that closure. Completely." As their children grew into their own independent lives, Wren establishing herself firmly in diplomatic circles, their son eventually pursuing historical scholarship that took him traveling between territories documenting governance patterns across generations. Mira found herself, increasingly, able to simply enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a life fully realized, built exactly as it should have been from that first terrifying, transformative night. There was a particular evening, nearly 15 years after Mira had first collided with Kael in the dark forest between their territories, when she found herself sitting alone in the garden that had grown, over the years, into something far beyond the modest wildflower patch she'd first admired as a frightened newcomer. The orchard Kale had planted for their children now produced fruit generous enough to share with neighboring territories during lean seasons. The small stone fountain he'd commissioned years earlier, its water still carrying the same soothing sound that had first drawn her attention during those early, uncertain weeks, continued running steadily, a constant presence through every season of change their family had experienced. "You look thoughtful," Kale observed, finding her there as the sun began setting, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of decades spent building a life together. "I was remembering that first night," Mira said. "How terrified I was, how certain I felt that my life was essentially over, one way or another, whether Dorian caught me or I simply had nowhere left to run. And instead I found everything I never knew I was allowed to want," she said. "A partnership built on respect instead of control. Children who understand, fundamentally, that love shouldn't require fear. A life that feels entirely mine, rather than something arranged for me by people who never bothered asking what I actually wanted. Kyle reached for her hand, the same gesture he'd offered countless times over the preceding 15 years, still carrying the same weight of genuine care it had held from the very beginning. I think about that night often too, he admitted. How close I came to simply walking past that section of the border. How different everything might have been if I'd taken a different path that particular evening. Do you believe in fate? Mira asked. Some larger design that ensured we'd find each other regardless of circumstance? I believe in choices, Kyle said. The choice you made to run rather than continue tolerating something unacceptable. The choice I made to protect rather than simply observe a stranger's distress. Every choice afterward, built deliberately on those first two decisions. He paused. Fate implies inevitability. I prefer to think we built this ourselves, through decisions that could have gone differently, but happened to go exactly right. Even the difficult parts? The confrontation with Dorian, the council meeting, all the uncertainty before we knew how it would resolve? Especially those parts, Kale said. They're proof that what we built wasn't simply luck, but genuine effort, sustained over time, through circumstances that could have easily gone wrong if either of us had made different choices. Mira leaned into him, watching their grown children move through the garden in the distance, Ren deep in animated conversation with a visiting diplomat about upcoming treaty negotiations, their son sitting quietly nearby with a book. Occasionally looking up to offer some historical context that made Ren pause thoughtfully before continuing her conversation. I ran from an arranged mate that night, Mira said quietly, echoing the very words that had once defined the entire trajectory of her escape, straight into the arms of the Alpha King. And found, Kyle finished, exactly as he had years earlier in a different garden. At a different but equally significant turning point in their shared history, exactly the life you were always meant to have. Every single day, Mira said, I'm grateful for that collision in the dark. As am I, Kyle said. Every single day, without exception. They sat together as the sun finished setting, the garden settling into evening quiet around them, their children's voices drifting faintly through the fading light, the entire complicated, difficult, ultimately beautiful decade and a half stretching behind them like undeniable proof that even the most frightening escapes could lead toward exactly the safety, love, and genuine partnership that had once felt entirely impossible to imagine. The final years of that particular decade brought their own quiet milestones, Ren's eventual marriage to a fellow diplomat she'd met through her territorial negotiations. A union built, unlike her mother's first arranged engagement, entirely on mutual choice and genuine partnership rather than political convenience. I want what you and Papa have, Ren told Mira during the preparations for her wedding, adjusting a simple, elegant gown that echoed, deliberately, the unpretentious style Mira herself had chosen years earlier. Not an arrangement. A genuine choice, renewed every day rather than assumed permanent from the outset. You'll have it, Mira said, with the complete certainty of someone who'd watched her daughter build relationships throughout her life with the same fairness and careful judgment that had defined her professional accomplishments. You've never settled for less than genuine respect from anyone in your life. I don't expect that to change now. The wedding itself took place in the same garden that had witnessed so many of the family's significant moments, the same fountain providing its steady, familiar sound as vows were exchanged beneath autumn leaves that had, by this point, become something of a family tradition for significant occasions. Mira watched her daughter exchange vows built on genuine partnership rather than obligation, and felt the particular satisfaction of watching a pattern successfully broken across generations, not just her own escape from Dorian's controlling arrangement, but the deliberate, sustained effort she and Kyle had made to raise children who understood, fundamentally, that love should never require the erasure of self that Mira herself had nearly accepted as inevitable during those difficult early years with Dorian. You did this, Kale told her quietly, watching their daughter's genuine happiness with her new husband. Not just surviving what happened with Dorian, but ensuring our children grew up understanding something entirely different was possible. We did this, Mira corrected gently. Together you taught them what genuine partnership looks like from a father's perspective, just as much as I taught them from a mother's. Their son, still deeply engaged in his historical scholarship, had begun compiling what would eventually become a significant work documenting patterns of governance reform across multiple territories, using his own family's experience with the dissolution of arranged marriage practices as one case study among several, examining how individual choices could gradually reshape broader systemic patterns. You're essentially writing our story into formal historical record, Mira observed, reviewing an early draft of his work with equal parts amusement and genuine pride. Our story is relevant to broader patterns, he said, entirely serious despite his mother's teasing tone. Understanding how individual acts of courage can create systemic change matters, historically speaking. Your decision to run and everything that followed isn't just a personal story. It's evidence of how change actually happens, incrementally, through individual choices that eventually accumulate into something larger. When did you become so wise about historical patterns? Kale asked, genuine curiosity beneath the teasing. I learned from watching my parents, their son said simply. You taught me that individual choices matter more than most people assume, watching how your own choices reshaped not just our family, but eventually entire treaty structures across eventually multiple territories. As the wedding celebration continued around them, Mira found herself reflecting, once again, on the particular strangeness of a life that had begun with such profound fear and uncertainty, transforming gradually, through countless individual choices, into something so completely, unrecognizably better than anything she could have imagined during that terrified sprint through unfamiliar forest darkness so many years earlier. In the years following Ren's wedding, Mira and Kyle settled into a quieter rhythm, their most demanding responsibilities gradually transitioning toward the next generation as their children took on increasing leadership roles within both their own territory and the broader network of alliances that had developed across the years. I never expected to feel this way about slowing down, Mira admitted one evening, watching Kyle review correspondence with considerably less urgency than he'd once brought to similar tasks during their early years together. I always imagined restlessness would define me indefinitely, given how my life started. Restlessness, born from fear, Kyle observed. Once the fear resolved, the restlessness had less reason to persist. Do you think about retiring from formal governance eventually? Mira asked. Letting Ren take on full authority, stepping back entirely from the responsibilities you've carried for so long? Kyle considered the question seriously, setting aside his papers to give it proper attention. Eventually, yes, he said, Ren has demonstrated more than sufficient capability. I don't intend to cling to authority simply because it's familiar, when someone genuinely more suited to modern challenges stands ready to take it on. That's remarkably gracious, for someone whose reputation once suggested an unwillingness to relinquish control of anything. That reputation was built during a different period of my life, Kale said. Before I understood that genuine strength sometimes means recognizing when someone else is better positioned to lead, rather than insisting on control simply because you've held it previously. The gradual transition of authority took place over the following years, careful and deliberate, rather than sudden, Ren assuming increasing responsibility while her parents remained available for consultation and support rather than direct control. A pattern that mirrored, deliberately, the partnership model they'd always tried to demonstrate, rather than simple hierarchical authority. You've built something remarkable here, an aging territorial elder observed during one of the final formal council meetings where Kale still held primary authority, watching Ren navigate a complex negotiation with the same confident fairness that had characterized her mother's approach for decades. Not just a stable territory, but genuine continuity of values across generations. That continuity was never guaranteed, Kyle said. It required deliberate effort, sustained over years, to ensure our children understood the values we wanted to pass forward rather than simply inheriting positions without understanding the responsibility attached. Mira, listening to this exchange, felt the particular satisfaction of watching decades of deliberate choices bear exactly the fruit she'd hoped for since those early, uncertain years when she'd first begun raising children within a household built on partnership rather than the controlling patterns that had nearly defined her own adolescence. That evening, sitting together in the garden that had witnessed so much of their shared history, Mira found herself returning, as she often did during quiet moments, to that first terrified night running through unfamiliar forest darkness, colliding unexpectedly with a stranger who chose, immediately and without hesitation, to offer protection rather than exploit vulnerability. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd simply looked the other way that night?" she asked Cale. "If you'd decided the shouting in your territory wasn't worth investigating personally?" "I try not to dwell on alternate possibilities," Cale said. "But when I do consider it, I feel an almost physical relief that I made the choice I actually made, rather than whatever alternative might have unfolded otherwise." "As do I," Mira said, leaning into him with the easy familiarity of decades spent building a life together. "Every single day, I'm grateful you chose to investigate, rather than ignore." The final transition of formal authority to Ren took place nearly 20 years after Mira's initial arrival at Kyle's territory, marked by a ceremony considerably more elaborate than either Kyle or Mira had originally wanted for themselves, but appropriate, they'd agreed, for marking the genuine significance of a peaceful, deliberate transfer of leadership between generations. "You built something extraordinary," Ren told her parents during the ceremony's private moments, before the formal public proceedings began. "Not just territorial stability, but a genuine model for how leadership can function without the control and fear that once defined so much of governance across these territories." "You'll build your own extraordinary things," Mira said. "This is simply the foundation we were able to provide. What comes next is entirely yours to shape." The public ceremony itself drew representatives from territories far beyond their immediate borders, evidence of how significantly Kyle's reign, and Mira's influence alongside it, had reshaped broader patterns of governance across the region during their decades of combined leadership. Even Ashwood Pack sent formal representation, led now by leadership several generations removed from Dorian's brief, troubled reign, the territory having long since transformed into something considerably more stable and fair than the controlling patterns that had once nearly defined Mira's entire future. "It's strange to think how differently everything might have unfolded," Mira observed to Kyle, watching the formal proceedings from a position of honor rather than direct authority for what felt, to both of them, like the first time in decades. "If I'd simply accepted the arrangement with Dorian rather than running." "You wouldn't have survived it," Cale said, quiet certainty in his voice. "Not the version of you that existed before that arrangement began eroding everything you were. Running wasn't simply one option among several equally viable paths. It was survival, disguised as escape. And I found so much more than mere survival," Mira said. "I found an entire life I never knew was possible." As the formal ceremony concluded, transitioning authority officially to their daughter's capable hands, Mira felt none of the loss she might have expected from relinquishing decades of accumulated influence and responsibility. Instead, she felt something closer to profound satisfaction, watching proof that everything she and KL had built together would continue, sustained and strengthened by the next generation, built on the same foundation of genuine partnership and mutual respect they'd worked so deliberately to establish. That evening, in the garden that had witnessed so much of their shared history across more than 2 decades, KL and Mira sat together, watching their children and grandchildren move through spaces that had grown, over the years, from a modest wildflower patch into something considerably more elaborate, though never losing the essential wildness that had first drawn Mira's attention during those early, uncertain weeks of her arrival. 20 years, Mira said quietly, watching the sunset paint the sky in the same gold and rose shades that had colored their wedding day so many years earlier. It's strange how quickly it passed, given how impossibly distant that first night feels now. 20 years, Cale agreed, built entirely from a single choice to run rather than continue tolerating something unacceptable. And a single choice to protect rather than ignore, Mira added. 2 choices, Cale said, that changed everything that followed. For both of us, and eventually for territories far beyond what either of us could have imagined that first terrified night. The years that followed Ren's formal assumption of leadership brought their own quiet satisfactions for Mira and Kyle, both of them settling gradually into roles more advisory than authoritative, watching with pride as their daughter navigated challenges that had once seemed daunting even to Kyle's considerable experience. "She handles disputes better than I ever did," Kyle admitted once, watching Ren mediate a complex conflict between neighboring territories with a patience and insight that drew from both her parents' strengths in ways that continued to surprise even them. "She learned from watching us make our own mistakes," Mira said. "That's perhaps the most valuable inheritance we could have offered. More valuable than territory or title alone." Their son, having completed his significant historical work documenting patterns of governance reform, found himself increasingly sought after as a consultant for territories navigating their own transitions away from controlling, arrangement-based systems similar to what had once defined Ashwood Pack under Dorian's brief, troubled leadership. "Your work is influencing actual policy decisions now," Mira told him proudly, during one of his periodic visits home between consulting engagements across various territories. "Not simply academic documentation, but genuine practical impact." "I learned from the best possible case study," he said, echoing sentiments he'd expressed years earlier during his initial research. "Watching how you and Father built something genuinely different from what preceded it. Understanding exactly what specific choices made that transformation possible, rather than simply assuming it happened by chance." Mira found herself, during this particular period of her life, reflecting often on the strange, winding path that had led from a terrified 15-year-old accepting an arrangement she'd never chosen, through years of gradually escalating fear and control, to a desperate midnight escape that had, against every reasonable expectation, led directly to exactly the life she'd never known to hope for. "Do you think Dorian ever understood what he lost?" she asked Cale once, during a quiet evening years after his death, the question surfacing unexpectedly during otherwise unrelated conversation. "Not just losing me specifically, but losing the opportunity to build something genuine rather than controlling?" "I doubt it," Cale said honestly. "Men who require control to feel secure rarely develop the self-awareness necessary to recognize what genuine partnership actually offers instead." "That's a sad way to live an entire life," Mira observed. "It is," Kyle agreed. "But it's not a tragedy that belongs to us any longer. We built something entirely different, deliberately, over decades of genuine effort. His failure to do the same reflects his own limitations, not any deficiency in what we managed to create instead." As their conversation settled into comfortable quiet, Mira found herself, as she often did during these reflective moments, grateful beyond easy articulation for the particular combination of desperate courage and fortunate circumstance that had defined that first, terrifying night courage to run from something unacceptable, and fortune to collide. Quite literally. With someone capable of recognizing her worth immediately, offering protection without demanding anything in return beyond the simple, honest partnership that had defined every year since. "I ran from an arranged mate," she said quietly, the same words she'd spoken years earlier in a similar reflective moment, "straight into the arms of the Alpha King, and found," Kyle finished, "exactly as he had before, exactly the partnership, the family, and the genuine love you deserved all along." Age eventually found them both, gently rather than harshly, the particular grace of a life well lived rather than merely survived, softening whatever difficulties came with growing older together, surrounded by children and eventually grandchildren who understood, fundamentally, exactly what kind of partnership they were meant to build in their own eventual relationships. I never imagined growing old, Mira admitted once, during one of their final years together, watching grandchildren play in the same garden that had witnessed so much of their shared history. Dorian's arrangement felt, at the time, like it would define my entire existence. However long or short that existence might have proven to be. And instead, you've had decades of genuine partnership, Kyle said, his own voice carrying the particular roughness that had developed with age, though his eyes remained exactly as steady and warm as they'd been that very first night. Decades you fought for, deliberately, rather than simply enduring whatever circumstance initially assigned you. We fought for it together, Mira corrected, as she always did when he attempted to credit her alone for what they'd built. Every difficult decision, every uncertain period, we navigated together rather than separately. The particular symmetry of their final years together felt, to both of them, entirely appropriate given how their story had begun. Mira running desperately through unfamiliar darkness, Kyle choosing without hesitation to offer protection rather than simply observing from safety. That same instinct toward mutual protection and support had defined every subsequent year of their partnership, through political challenges, through raising children who understood genuine partnership rather than controlling arrangement, through the eventual peaceful transition of authority to a new generation capable of carrying their values forward. Ren tells me the territory continues thriving, Mira said during one of their final quiet evenings together, watching sunset paint the familiar garden in gold and rose, better than either of us managed alone. Honestly, she learned from watching two people navigate genuine partnership rather than mere obligation, Kyle said. That lesson matters more than any specific policy decision either of us made during our own years of authority. Do you regret anything? Mira asked, the question surfacing with the particular honesty that decades of genuine partnership had made comfortable between them. Any choice, any moment, across everything we've built together? KL considered the question with the same careful seriousness he'd brought to every significant decision throughout their partnership. I regret that you suffered under Dorian's arrangement before we found each other, he said finally. I wish circumstances had allowed us to meet sooner, sparing you those difficult years entirely. I don't regret them, Mira said, surprising him slightly with the certainty in her voice. Those years taught me exactly what I refused to accept ever again, exactly what genuine partnership needed to look like in contrast. Without that contrast, I'm not certain I would have recognized how remarkable what you offered actually was. That first terrified night. A strange kind of gratitude, KL observed, for suffering that shaped appreciation for what came afterward. An honest one, though. Mira said, I wouldn't undo any part of this particular winding path, even the difficult sections, given where it eventually led. They sat together as the sun finished setting, the same fountain providing its steady, familiar sound, their entire shared history stretching behind them like undeniable proof that the most frightening beginnings could lead, through sustained courage and genuine choice, toward exactly the partnership and belonging that Mira had once believed entirely impossible to hope for. Kyle reached for her hand one final time that evening, the same gesture he'd offered countless times across their decades together, his grip still carrying the same steady warmth it had held that very first terrifying night when she'd collided with him in the dark. Thank you, Mira said quietly, watching the last light fade from the sky above the garden they'd built together. For what, specifically? Kyle asked, though something in his expression suggested he already understood. For choosing to investigate the shouting that night, she said, instead of simply letting whatever conflict was happening resolve itself without your involvement. For choosing protection over convenience every single time it mattered. You chose to run, Kale reminded her gently. That courage came first, before I ever had the chance to choose anything in response. Then thank you for meeting that courage with something equally brave, Mira said, choosing to stand between me and everything I was afraid of, without knowing anything about who I actually was beyond a terrified stranger crashing into your evening. I knew enough, Kyle said, echoing words he'd spoken to her years earlier during that same pivotal conversation in his study. I knew someone was running from cruelty, and that mattered more than any uncertainty about the rest. They sat together in comfortable silence as darkness settled fully over the garden, their children's laughter long since faded into memories of earlier decades, their grandchildren's voices now carrying faintly from somewhere inside the palace, the entire accumulated weight of a life built deliberately, through genuine choice rather than mere circumstance, settling around them like the particular contentment that comes only from a story lived fully and well. I ran from an arranged mate that night, Mira said one final time, the words carrying decades of accumulated meaning now, straight into the arms of the Alpha King. And found, Kyle finished, pulling her close with the same steady certainty he'd offered every single day since. Exactly the love, the partnership, and the genuine home you deserved all along.